Okay, this will be a response to Shaun and Jen. They made a video to three people. I was one of the three people. Well, it was a response to the alternative hypothesis. So it was a response to a video of me narrating an article that was written by Shaun Last from the alternative hypothesis, not Shaun from the Shaun and Jen duo here. Okay, if that makes any sense. If you're not, I bet you a bunch of people are already confused. Anyway, this is a response to a video response. So I was thinking about making a big long video, writing up a script, cutting up his clips. This is probably going to be a long video in terms of like the listener listening to it. But when I say long video, like I'm sort of thinking about how long it would take me to make the video. And I was thinking about how to make that kind of video with the cut up clips and the sources and the timestamps and all that stuff. And then I thought, that sounds like a lot of work for something that he said to me that he didn't put a whole lot of work into. And moreover, I'm thinking about what it is I want to talk about, and very little of it is going to involve stuff that Shaun said. So it's going to be more highlighting. It's going to be more talking about other things that are tangential to what Shaun said that I think are kind of interesting and are sort of highlighted by the way that Shaun responded to me. But before getting into any of that, lest people sort of accuse me of dodging criticism, I'll go through his four main dumb criticisms of my video. Shaun and my video, "White America" was the video, and the video "White America" it was basically looking at whites in the United States, saying how white people voted, okay, and seeing like tax revenues, right? The net fiscal impacts of whites, blacks, and Hispanics, policies supported by whites, blacks, and Hispanics, uh, sort of inferring, what the social effects of not having whites, blacks, or Hispanics would be like. Looking at schools, looking for example that white students do better in schools where it's just white people when they're not around blacks and Hispanics. So, and it's just sort of an aggregation of a bunch of those things. And sort of with that saying, this is sort of, kind of what like a white America, right? If the white portion of America was extracted into a new country, what that would sort of look like. Okay, now, now most people understand what this is. Okay, I didn't. No, nobody in the comments section came in and said, that would be very difficult to do in reality because most firms, like, there's almost no firms that are white only. So any firm going into this new white America would have to completely restructure their labor force and blah, 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 right? Nobody is so, or very few are so concrete bound as to make a criticism of what we're doing that's that stupid, right? But that's exactly what Shaun did, right? He said, "Oh, you like if you were to just sort of poof them away, like, like he just like he doesn't understand what the video is trying to do." Okay, he's thinking about this in really concrete terms, like if you were to poof blacks and Hispanics away, then there'd be a mass there'd be you'd have all sorts of continuity errors and change in chains of production, and that would be difficult, and so it's really it's a really weird, really dumb kind of objection. But one thing I'm thinking of is that like that's an objection that seems like really stupid to me because that's has no relevance to what the video was actually talking about. But then I was thinking, what? That's actually maybe something that Shaun and I should be better at is dealing with the objections that people actually make as opposed to what are actually good objections. Because Shaun and I, we write stuff and we have an idea of what the weaknesses of what it is we write about actually are. But it's very rare for the actual weaknesses of what it is we write and talk about to actually get highlighted. In fact, the only people who actually are good at finding the real weaknesses in our arguments are people on our own side. But anyway, it's a bit of a tangent. So he was basically saying, I don't understand butterfly effects. And another thing that was what was bizarre is he was thinking about this in concrete terms, like, okay, so maybe him thinking about me is going, well, okay, so maybe he's thinking about what would the United States look like if no blacks and no Hispanics ever came in at all. I mean, we can bypass sort of the Native Americans because they're such a small population. It's kind of incidental, but and then he said about that is, but that's going to have big butterfly effects as well, and there's no way you can predict what it would be like. Now, first off, that's not even what I was talking about. I wasn't talking about this in real terms. I was just sort of, you know, observations come first. You know, let's look at the effects here in a sort of disintegrated way of white people, and then you can have a discussion about, you know, beyond that. Then you can have a discussion about the butterfly effects or whatever. But but barring that, like even if we were to think about like a hypothetical white United States that never had slavery and never let in any non-Europeans, you know, sans the Native Americans, who cares? Um, if you were, and then he says like we could not predict what that would be like, and I am not well. So here's the problem: is that we don't actually have a time machine. We can't go back and change the variables and then make predictions and see, aha, I can predict. But I mean, we know broadly speaking what the United States looked like when blacks were largely marginalized from the political process. We know what the North was like relative to the South, you know, and we could probably infer that the South would have been more like the North in the absence of slavery. Like, there's all sort like, you know, and we know what Australia was like, you know, we know what Canada was like for most of its history. Okay, we know what Britain was like, so we can make, you know, a fair, like, this idea that we can't make any real predictions of what the United States would have been like if it was all white. You know, who knows, if it was all white, maybe it would have been like Mad Max or something. You can't predict, you can't know. It seems like a silly thing that I don't think Shaun himself really believes, that we don't have any idea what the U.S. would be like if it were all white from the beginning. Um, so that like that's a dumb point, one, but it's not even relevant to what the video was. And I think and the people who actually watched the video, White America, I don't think they were thinking about this in terms of like, you know, instantaneously poofing away all the blacks and Hispanics, and then this is exactly what the United States would look like. Like, that's not what we're talking about. Um, and of course, because and this is more like amazingness from Shaun, is not Shaun Lance, this Shaun, is that because he is so concrete bound and he doesn't know, like he doesn't know what a thought experiment is, and he doesn't know what it means to sort of analyze he doesn't, like, if you were to hold this Shaun's standards of things, like, you could never ever isolate, you could never analyze a enmeshed variable, right? Because you could always come in and say, well, you know, we don't know how that X is going to behave in another environment, because the way it's behaving in this environment is largely dependent on the environmental factors over here, right? It's stupid. It's paralyzing. It is a paralyzing standard. You can say that to infinity, right? You can say, well, here's how black people are in the United States. You know, they high crime, high welfare use. Oh, and they hollow out cities. They destroy Detroit. They destroy St. Louis. They destroy Baltimore. Everything. Okay, here's how blacks are when they have a country in the Western Hemisphere, in Haiti, a country that got its independence, I think, around 1840. Right? Look, it looks a lot like the rest of Africa. Okay. Oh, here's how blacks are in the UK. You know, blacks in the UK, however, are a little bit of a elite sample, a strict selection. But even blacks in the UK, they score lower on standardized tests. That's something I need to make another video about, because people talk about this A-level crap. Um, but I'll get into that later. Like, like the elite universities in the UK are not fooled by all the A levels that the black students get. Okay, um, but I should make another video about that. But fine, skip Britain because they have a bunch of stupid. They have a really stupid they have a stupid sort of like end of high school criteria thing that ends up making it look like it ends up making it look like brown people are smarter than they really are because their tests are not basically because their tests go for at the end there are not IQ tests, whereas the SAT is kind of an IQ. Anyway, but forget that. Let's talk about the Somalis in Sweden or the Somalis in Denmark. I believe there was something out in Denmark, you know, with the immigrants there, where they were talking about how like a majority of benefits being used in Denmark, or maybe it was Holland or something. But anyway, the point I'm making is that black people, and it doesn't matter East Africans, West Africans. I know there's all sorts of there's about as much genetic variation within the continent of Africa as there is without the continent of Africa. So yeah, I know when I say black people, I'm basically referring to about half of all human genetic variation. But the thing is, it doesn't matter where and when they are, right? They're still like a net negative. Even in the UK, they're net negative. Okay. And I say even in the UK, they're just as much of a net negative in the UK as they are in Germany or Canada or Sweden or Finland or anything. So, so you see a universal phenomenon, right? And and to then imagine like, well, you don't know like black people. Well, we know what they're like in Sweden, in Germany, in Denmark, in the UK, in Canada, in the United States. Okay, we know where they are in all these places. In Brazil, okay, in South Africa, okay, but in Haiti, but we don't know what will the black people be like if they go to um, if they go to let's say Spain. Well, we kind of know what they are like in Spain, so scratch that. But let's say that there's some country where there are no black people, and we want to imagine what they'll be like in that country. Let's say Argentina. There's a few black people in Argentina, but not many. But let's say you import a bunch of black people in Argentina. What are they going to be like? Like, well, maybe even though it has not happened in any other country, maybe in Argentina, you have to just pretend to be stupid. Like that's really what you're doing there, and sort of imagining that we can't infer what these people are going to be like because any instance is always going to be somewhat, I guess, historically bound by the circumstances. And so you can always say, well, how blacks behaved in Canada, that doesn't count because of these circumstances. Or how blacks behaved in the US, that doesn't count because of these circumstances. UK, that doesn't count. That, like, you can always say it doesn't count because of these circumstances, and therefore you end up not being able to say anything about any racial group, and you end up reducing literally everything to circumstance. Everything is some sort of circumstantial argument. Right? And most of it is bogus anyway. Like people will say, "Oh, see, the reason that the Somalis are, really crappy in Sweden is because of Swedish racism or something daft like that." That it's there's no grounding anywhere in any of that. And so that's that's kind of what he's doing here with this, with trying to say that everything's confounded by circumstance, and so you can never make any predictions, you can never say anything. Um, but then he goes on to like genocide and accusing me of secretly wanting a genocide of the other races. Now, this is a difficult thing on a few levels. The first level is whenever someone it doesn't make and I don't know if he's trying this as like some sort of tactic. I don't think he's that smart. Um, but one thing you could do is what a reporter will ask somebody if they want to really attack them is they'll say, "Do you support something horrible?" And the politician will say no. And you ask him again, do you support this thing horrible? And the politician will say, no, I don't support, you know, I don't support, mass genocide or something. Okay, and you keep asking that, and what ends up happening is, oh, guess what? This politician is now spending a whole lot of time talking about genocide, and I think that was the David Duke thing with Trump. Reporters would ask Trump about David Duke and say, "Do you disavow David Duke?" And he would say, "Yeah, I do. Whatever. Let's move on." Then he would say, "What do you think about David Duke?" Something about David Duke. All right, and what this did was it kept Trump talking about David Duke. You see? And so they could write a story and said, here's what Trump had to say about David Duke and why Trump does not wish to be associated with David Duke. And so what does that do in the minds of like the low info readers? It connects Trump to David Duke. Okay? And so when people say, okay, so do you support genocide of other races? And what they're doing is they're getting you to talk about genocide of other races. You're now talking about genocide of other races. Okay? That's the point. That's what they're trying to get you to talk about. Right? So that's why it's shitty. Right? It's a shitty thing to talk about. And he says, do you support the genocide of other races? I mean, like, do you? Like, fuck off. But the reason he brought it up is it's because he's so concrete bound. Because I make this video, White America, trying to, in a sort of isolated and frankly unrealistic sense, what would a white America look like if we literally just extracted white people and assumed that would be the statistical portrait of white America? What would that be like? He's thinking, because he's so concrete bound, because his brain is so like primitive, he's thinking about this, how would this come about in real physical terms? That's what he's thinking. Okay? And so if you do that, if you think about that in terms of how white America would come about in real physical terms, okay, well then you have to not have those. you have to not have non-whites in white America, right? And how is that done? Well, you'd have so that's where his mind is going. Basically, his thinking that I'm secretly proposing genocide or secretly trying to implant the seed of genocide in the viewers or whatever is a function of him being so concrete bound in his thinking, right? So that's his genocide crowd. Okay, so those were two of the things, genocide and I don't understand butterfly effects. The next thing he was talking about was Asians. He's saying that, but I don't know. Apparently he thought that I don't understand that Asians exist. Like he was saying, well, if you care so much about America and the statistical portrait of America, and you want America to benefit by being white only, well, actually, Asians have a better statistical portrait, so you should have America be Asian only, right? So he totally, first off, this is just a continuation of him not understanding what the video was saying, one. So, and I'm not going to harp on that. Like, that's a criticism that is irrelevant to what the video was actually doing, one. But two, let me put it like this. White people aren't running around decrying Asian privilege, okay? White people aren't running around saying that we are put upon by the Asian menace that is keeping us down, that is oppressing us, that they have their Asian privilege, they have their Asian connection networks, and they're doing something. No, like white people don't do that. White people don't sit around kvetching about some other group being richer than them. Okay, so it's kind of irrelevant. The reason that the video White America is relevant is because you have a bunch of Mesoamericans and a bunch of blacks kvetching about how they're in a crappier state in all sorts of metrics than white people, specifically white people. They're not complaining about Asian people. Now we can sort of talk about sort of the psychopathology that goes into them focusing only on whites, but as it happens, they're not talking about Asians. They're not crying about Asians. They're only crying about white people, right? And so-called white privilege. Okay, so that's why it's relevant. That's why we talk about white America, not Asian America. Okay, because it's talking about, like, look, because one of the lines that these people say all over the place is that, you know, white people benefit from all these brown people, and white people in the U.S. are exploiting all of these brown people. But when we do this sort of, and again, it's not taking into consideration butterfly effects. We get that. But when you sort of extract the white element from the United States and have sort of a statistical portrait of them, you can say it doesn't really seem like white people are benefiting from having these other people around. That's the point of that. Okay? And it's an important argument at the level of priors, okay, which is going to influence at the level of policy, but I'll get into, priors versus policy later. That's one of the things that I want to talk about more at some length. Okay, and the last thing that he talked about, another thing about Asians, then he said that I'm fine with, like, Asians having like a Asian country carved out of the United States around San Francisco or something. Like, I don't care. But anyway, then he talks about me being a coward because I'm not. Because in my 8-minute video on white America, I didn't then go into policy. Now, the thing about that, like, what if at the end of the video, let's just think about this for a second. Let's say at the end of the video, I then said, after going through all that stuff, then said, and this is why white people should try to carve out an ethno-state out of the United States. What if I said that? What if I said that? Well, what would all the comments on that video be about? Okay, it would be about that policy recommendation. Okay, and see, this gets into priors versus policy. See, what White America video was, it was a video that wasn't about policy. It was a video about priors. Okay, because when you go in and you have a policy discussion, there's a whole lot of prior beliefs that go into that policy discussion. And what Shaun is doing, and why he made such an error in understanding what my video was about, or what our video was about, is he's operating at the level of policy, where that video is operating at the sort of goes into's of beliefs that inform policy. Basically, he's operating, I don't know, just using it at like a programming language analogy, like we're operating at assembly and he's operating at Java. Maybe it's probably not that big of a gap, but I think you understand what I'm saying, is that what we're doing, like, because we know that if, like let's say we come out, right, and because what he wants to do is he wants us to put our final policy objectives forward in a nutshell, okay, so that he can then attack those policies based on the priors that he has and the priors that most people in the world today have. Now, if that happens, if you do that, then yes, racial separatism is going to go up in flames. And and if I thought this guy were kind of smart, I would think that was the point, but I don't think he's smart enough for that to be the point. I think he's just kind of unaware of what it is he's doing. Like, so yeah, that's the point, is the beliefs that go into that go into the discussion. And so, like this is something that's very common to people who have never held a a heterodox belief on anything. Is that they jump to the immediate policy conclusions right away, and for that, that's a stupid game that's going to go nowhere. Well, it's not going to go. Well, it's not going to go nowhere. But the thing is, you're not going to get any intellectual movement with if you immediately say what policies do you support. Here's something that I think would be a better way to think about it. Let's say you go back to the year 1800, okay, and you went to the typical person in the year 1800, and you told them that they should support, not just support homosexual, because you have to remember back then homosexuality was outlawed, was illegal in most places. So not only should they support homosexuality, but they should support gay marriage, okay, that allowing homosexuals to be married, that they should allow adultery, that is having sex outside of marriage should be legal, and not only that, but that having children outside of marriage should be legal, okay, and then trying to tell them that they should support blacks being citizens in the United States. I mean, forget forget anything else. The fact that that black people should be granted a pathway to citizenship in the United States, right? All the slaves should be freed and granted citizenship, okay? And that these black slaves who are then granted citizenship should be allowed to vote, and that the United States should have a black president, okay? And that, people who don't work should be given money from people who do work, not from some sort of charity or some sort of fraternal society, but by the government telling people you pay taxes to pay for people who don't work, including people of other races and people of other religions who don't work, that the federal government should take some of your money and give that money to other countries in the form of foreign aid, okay? I mean, if you were to go back to the year 1800 and and present to these people those as the final policy conclusions that they should come to, that was where, that was where, I guess, I don't know what you would want to call it, it's not liberal, I guess you call it the leftist, but I don't even want to call it that. But we need to use a term and call it something. We'll call it the leftist project. If you were to present that to them at that time, right, that as being the final outcome, they would flip their shit. They would lose it. They would think this is nuts. This is going to cause all sorts of problems. This is not a world that I want to live in. I will not support this. And they wouldn't listen to you for one moment if you showed them the world today. If you showed them the world today, now if you showed them the world today, they'd see a lot of technology and they go, "This is amazing." But we're talking about the social changes. If you showed them the world today, just in terms of the social changes that this is the policy outcome that you were proposing, they wouldn't listen to the first thing that you were saying. Okay? Because their prior beliefs are so radically different from the prior beliefs that people in the world today have. Okay? And that's and so when you're pushing a very heterodox view of things, you have a lot of different prior beliefs than everyone else around you has. Okay? Like when Lenin was in the Soviet Union, they didn't run around telling the peasant class oh yeah, and at the end of the day, we're going to have the state will wither away, and it's going to be a stateless a stateless communism, but nothing's going to be enforced. People will just produce and share everything they produce, because a new kind of man will be created through radical environmental reconstruction done by the state, right? That the state is going to intervene, control all the schools, radically change the way everybody thinks into a pure collectivist mold, and then they will act in a collective manner, regardless of their own individuality, to such an extent that the state will no longer be necessary to enforce collectivist models, and the state will simply sort of wither away, and then you'll have stateless communism at the end of the game. Like if Lenin went around saying that to everybody, they'd all think he's a kook. Okay, they'd all think that's insane. All right, and that's kind of why Marxism today, like orthodox Marxism today, is seen as kind of loony by most people because and it's because of the priors. Okay, because all the prior beliefs that lead up to ultimately this sort of Marxist viewpoint don't they don't have time to establish it, because what happens is the critics of Marxism say this is the end state, this is their ultimate policy objective, right? And people look at that, and these people don't have, like, for example, a belief in the radical malleability of human nature. They don't have a belief in, for example, they don't have a belief that that capitalists are inherently parasitic, that people today typically view profit as basically the wage earned by the capitalist, and they don't see that as inherently oppressive, and they don't see that, and they don't see things in terms of a historical progression from feudalism to capitalism to the dictator, the various stages or whatever, right? And so they don't, and they didn't hear Marx's arguments for why, Marx then lays out, look, in this place there was a progression from feudalism to capitalism to blah 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 blah. It happened here, feudalism, capitalism, blah blah blah. And it starts off sort of with the social democracy, but then you get a dictatorship of the proletariat, and he lays out how this appears to have happened in multiple places, and appears to be trending that way in Britain, and sort of makes kind of a, and it's kind of a historical connect the dots sort of what Marx was doing, and that's fine, but. And to me, that's not really compelling, because I'm fairly skeptical of historical connect the dots games, but I'm not trying to say that Marx is wrong. I personally think he is, and it's all kind of stupid. But for the average person, they're going to reject Marxism because they don't hold any of those priors. Okay, and so when you immediately show the policy conclusions that lead from being an orthodox Marxist, people are going to flip. They're going to flip the fuck out, right? So Lenin didn't do that, and the Bolsheviks, they didn't do that. They didn't tell people what the final end state was going to be. And luckily, most of the Russians were illiterate, so there couldn't be somebody who went around who actually knew and could then, inform all the peasantry that this is the end state and basically kill the Bolsheviks, kill them in terms of their chances for winning, taking over the government. And so, and it wasn't until later that once they had power, then they were working in these schools to try to implant those. They didn't use these words, but basically what they did is that once they took over the government, then the Bolsheviks worked to sort of implant prior beliefs in people to get them on board with the Marxist policy agenda, right? To quote unquote fix their prior beliefs, to change their prior beliefs from those of what they had before to supporting, Marxism. Okay, and that's really, and that's kind of a long-winded thing, but it's something that I think sort of needed to be said by me eventually, is that if you want an idea in a nutshell, you're not gonna, you can't communicate a whole lot of information in a nutshell to people who have radically different priors than you. Now, if you were to argue, say, with like a Tory or a Republican, okay, you could, Shaun is probably a shit lib or whatever, but you share, like 80% of your priors you share with a Tory or a U.S. Republican, right? And so a Tory or a U.S. Republican can communicate a lot of information to you really, really fast because because 80% of your code is the same, right? So it's like he only it's kind of like symbolic calling of things. It's like he only has to say like he can basically say to you like a 4-bit string of data, but of course that 4-bit string of data then calls a whole bunch of other data. Let's like an example would be, I don't know, the Holocaust, right? He could say like, these people, they are, this Ahmadinejad guy in Iran, back when Ahmadinejad was around, he could say, this guy is like another Hitler. Okay, that's 2 words or 3 words, like another Hitler. So very small amount of information, but with that, he could call like all sorts of prior beliefs that exist in your head, because he knows what you think about. He would and so do I. Like I went to public schools. I know what you think about all these things. I know what you think about the great Martin Luther King, right? I know what you think about all this, right? So it's like, a few bits of data, and they can call, Ku Klux Klan, you know. Then that calls like, just it's like 2 bits of data, then calls in like 64 megabits of data, right? That's how and that's how it works, and that's why you can communicate so much information so fast with somebody who shares all your priors. Like, let me put it this way: what I'm trying to do for people is I'm kind of like trying to teach baseball to people who don't know what a ball is. It's like going in, like, as you start to teach baseball, it's like, okay, this is a ball, right? That's kind of what I'm trying to do. And then it's like, this is a bat. You hit the bat. Okay, this is what hitting is. You hit, okay, and you hit the ball with the bat, and trying to, like, literally telling them, here's what shoes are. You wear these and you put them on your feet. Your feet are these areas. Now, where the foot and the ankle begins, that's a bit of a subjective criteria, but the difference between the feet and the ankle are semi-discrete, and we can draw a line here. And, that's sort of like what we're doing here when we're trying to say, when you try to do anything that is non-universalist. Okay, so, and sorry, this video has been sort of esoteric here, but whatever. I don't, whatever. It's a crap video that I'm responding to. It's not really worth a whole lot of goes into it. So okay, so that's basically it. So he's calling me a coward for hiding the fact that I'm like a white separatist or white nationalist. Now, the problem is the term white nationalist would be a good term if not for the 1488ers. Because, like, nationalism is fine. Nationalism is a good term. White is a good term. Like, white nation, white nationalism. It should be a good term. White nationalism should be a good term for what it is I support. The problem, though, is that whenever you say it, people immediately jump to Hitlerism. And it's a great irony. It's a great irony because Winston, keep Britain white Churchill, was, the biggest anti-Hitler guy there ever was. In fact, Winston Churchill was anti-Hitler before it was cool. Like, he was anti-Hitler when most people in Britain and France were not so anti-Hitler. Most people in Britain and France were kind of, like, well, he's some problems with Hitler, but, I mean, look, what did Hitler do that's so horrible? Oh, he invaded the Rhineland, which is part of Germany. Oh, he invaded Austria. But guess what? The majority of Austrians wanted to be part of Germany, and the rate of volunteers for Austria and the rest of Germany was about the same. So the idea that they were like an occupied territory is just sort of a joke, right? And so the people were making these sorts of arguments. But Winston, to either his credit or his detriment, whatever it is you want to think about that in the past, most people today would say to his credit, he was anti-Hitler long before anyone else was anti-Hitler. And yet, Winston Churchill had all sorts of things to say about the Muslims. He called the Muslims a stain on the earth, and he wanted to keep Britain white. He wanted he didn't want anybody from the rest of the empire, quote unquote, to come into the British Isles. Okay, and he did not view these other races particularly fondly. So now, as an aside, the populations that seem to have the most negative views of other races, like the whites in South Africa, supported apartheid, whereas the whites in Canada and Britain and they were just aghast at such horrible policies. Oh, how could you possibly segregate yourselves from the blacks? They're human beings just like you, don't you know? All their huff and puff sensibilities. And of course, whites who lived like in Mississippi and in Alabama and in Louisiana, who actually have to live around all these black people, they were big fans of state enforced segregation. Whereas white people who lived in places like Maine and Wisconsin and Minnesota, all these lily white little enclaves that don't actually have to deal with real black people, they thought that this segregation thing was just, oh, it was just so inhumane. And how could you treat these, your brothers? They bleed red just like you, don't you know? So, um, but that's a bit of a tangent. Back to what I was talking about, Hitler. Yeah, but it's just bizarre that like the people who fought against Hitler today, they'd be white nationalists if you transpose their views today. Now, would they be white nationalists if they were born and raised and went through the current school system? No. But, I mean, if you transpose their views on today, those views would be labeled today white nationalist views, right? And they were all anti-Hitler, see? And so that's sort of the bizarre thing here, is that what kind of happened is that we're being called, or excuse me, I and Shaun get called Nazi for holding views of race that were held by like 80% of the people at the time who fought the Nazis. Right? That's sort of the great irony here. Or for example, like we're tied to like the Confederacy because like we're tied to the Confederacy because we hold the racial views of people in the North who were opposed to the Confederacy, right? Like for example, the state of Oregon, I believe until I don't know, it was pretty late. I think it was after like 1900 that the state of Oregon actually had in their constitution a law saying that no black person may set foot in Oregon, right? Free or slave, right? It what like and that's something that a lot of people don't know. I'm not necessarily saying that you, Shaun, don't know, but a lot of people don't know is that the abolitionists were also segregationists, right? The abolitionists, they wanted to end slavery because slavery is immoral, but a bunch of them wanted to send them back to Africa. And part of their support for abolitionism was that they didn't want any black people around here, period. Okay? And the Free Soil movement, right? And the Free Soil Party, part of their platform was, yeah, they didn't want any slaves out in the new western states, but guess what? They didn't want any free blacks out there either. So, and so basically, like, for me and Shaun having the views of the Free Soil Party, okay, we are, and having the views of like of Oregon in 1850, that we are then like associated with the Confederacy, and that's sort of the weird, but that's sort of a product of great historical illiteracy that people have, and it's a historical illiteracy that not just average Joe people, but a surprising number of people who you'd think would know better, people with all sorts of history credentials. Like I tell them that Oregon basically had laws against blacks even coming to the state. They're just shocked, right? And these are people who you would think would know things like that. But anyway, that's a bit of a tangent, and that's why the term white nationalist is problematic, is because it's associated with a bunch of crap that that it should not be associated with. But there's a problem, right? Is that there are these idiots, right? And there are people like, okay, I'm gonna have to call out names and have to punch right a little bit here. There are people like Andrew Anglin, and there are a bunch of neo-Confederates running around who then say, we are white nationalists. And it's true, they are. But they don't. They also believe a bunch of incorrect things about things. So it's and so what ends up happening is that like people who are white nationalists but aren't Hitlerites, okay, who in fact have a very dim view of Hitlerism, end up getting associated with that. And in addition, like what happened with the term, what's happening, and it's happening again. It's happening with alt-right as well. Okay, there are a bunch of people who said we're alt-right, and part of it was just trying to escape the 1488ers, trying to escape Andrew Anglin, right, and the Daily Stormer types and the Stormfront types. And what does Andrew Anglin do? He says, Daily Stormer, the biggest alt-right. He's calling himself alt-right. So now it's like there's no, like, these people are jerks. They're assholes. Yeah, they're just, and it's one of the reasons why I don't want to use a term like white. Now I'm perfectly happy to describe to you what it is I support, and I'll even describe the policy positions as well. But but of course, when I describe the policy positions, then you go in with all sorts of priors and saying, well, just bring in the Mexicans as long as you give them good schools and proper nutrition and all that stuff. Their IQs will be just as high as those of white people because everything's environmental, nothing's genetic, and don't you know that 99% of English literature professors all know that all things are environmental, right? So that's part of why, I don't like to use the term white nationalism, and I don't like to give you things in a nutshell, okay? And it all has to do with priors and associations. Okay, one thing I want to do, though, is I want to give some props to Shaun here, who made the response to me. Is that in the video, White America, one thing I did was I talked about how white people do better when they're in all-white schools. And then I said perhaps their scores on PISA test, instead of being 518, would be 520. Now, I want to give props to Shaun for something he didn't do. He didn't then go like, well, how do you know it would go up 2 points? You're just speculating based on improvements from class, but you don't know if in an all-white country their points score would go up 2 points. And why are you saying 2 points? Where does that number come from? Right? He didn't go down that rabbit hole. He wasn't like an autistic prick that did that. Now, that could be because he was just too lazy. He just didn't want to. He didn't think it was worth the time or effort to say something that shitty to be an autistic little prick, right? It could be that, but I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt that he, is reasonable enough to say, 2 points. He thinks it's 2 points, whatever. That's his sort of, guesstimation based on a qualitative reading of other studies. So I want to give you props for that thing that you didn't do, one. And the second thing I want to give you props for something you didn't do was use the term white supremacist. Okay? Because it's like there's all sorts of nationalisms, right? Like there's all sorts of like the existence of Japan as a country, to be Japanese and to not bring in, they bring in some immigrants, but bringing in a very small number of immigrants into Japan and keeping Japan Japanese, would you then use the term that they are Japanese supremacist? I mean, it's a bizarre term. In a sense, I guess the Japanese are supremacist in that they want that which is Japanese. Now we could get into a long, big discussion on what it means to be Japanese or whatever, but barring that, sure, I guess maybe they are supremacist in the sense that they want Japanese-ness to remain supreme over a given territory, as the Japanese islands. Same with Korean nationalists. In a sense, they are Korean supremacists in that they want in a certain area Koreanness to be supreme. And you could say that about any group that wants a region, that wants to carve out a chunk of the planet for themselves. In that chunk, they are supreme, right? And so, but then what happens with the United States is there's a bunch of white people in the United States who say, well, okay, well, we want a chunk of the United States to be carved out for white people. And in this chunk of land in the United States, whiteness, now, what is white? Okay, but not going down that rabbit hole for now. Whiteness will be supreme in that area. Aha, white supremacist, right? Do you see how stupid that is? So I want to give Shaun props for not doing that. That's what I want to do. Okay. How long is this? This is going to be a long video. Wow, it's like 51 minutes already. Whatever, I'll just keep going. So, what I want to say about something that Shaun is doing, and this is not, and not to pick on this one guy too much, is that something that I heard somewhere. I have source amnesia here. I don't remember where I heard it from. But what I heard was somebody said something that really stuck with me, and it's that observations come first. And it seems like such a simple line. It's so, but yeah, of course observations come first. It's almost trivial. But it's amazing how different you think from other people if you constantly call that line. Observations come first. You do something, and whenever you're looking at something, you go, right, observations come first. So what that means, and what that to me is that when you look at, you want to spend time, you spend a lot of time just looking at, well, for me, it's a lot of time looking at spreadsheets. Lots of time looking at spreadsheets. And looking at tables and papers and stuff. So, so, it's kind of a continuum to what extent you are an observations comes first person, or you are somebody who jumps, conclusion, gotta conclude, gotta get to something, gotta get to the point. What's the point? What point are you trying to make? And so when I have this observations comes first sort of mentality, when I read papers, it's like, some people may say like, well, where's the author trying to lead you? I don't care where the author is trying to lead me. Never mind what it is he's saying leads to. Okay, if it leads off a cliff, then off a cliff we go. Okay, never mind whatever intentions are or anything. Let's just look at the observations. Let's look at what they have to say and not be so fucking judgmental about it. Okay? Like if somebody wants to say, look, black people have, well, actually they don't have higher A levels, but let's say, look, black people have a higher number of A levels or whatever than you would expect from an IQ of 85. And in fact, if you did a linear regression, for white people by A levels and black people by A levels, you would predict that the IQ of blacks in the UK would be like 97 based on their A levels. Okay? Now I look at that and I go, well, okay. That is observed. Okay? I don't then jump to all sorts of conclusions that, racial hereditarianism must be wrong. Okay, we just sort of leave that there. And when you leave it there, it seems to be some sort of. It's like in every theory you have, there's going to be there's going to be some contradictory evidence floating around that you don't have an answer to. Okay, that's true. That's true in any scientific theory. Okay, there's always going to be like these ideas floating around in the background that you don't know how to answer right away, right? So just leave them there. Just say, I don't know how to answer this, but I don't think it's enough to. Now, as it happens, just through reading a whole bunch of stuff, I'm starting to find things regarding like the Africans in the UK. I'm starting to find things on that, that say, well, actually, okay, their A levels are higher. However, if you give standardized tests to representative student bodies, it looks like their IQ is actually about 92. Okay, so for whatever reason, they're getting more A levels than what it seems their IQ is. Like, oh, but then again, the CAT, the cognitive assessment test that they give to students in Britain. On that test, blacks in the U.S. also scored a 92. However, blacks, if you normalize their scores from the SAT, or you just look at straight IQ data, blacks in the U.S. are about 84 to 86, depending on the age group. So this test that yielded a score of 92 for blacks in the UK also yielded a score of 92 for whites in the US. Okay. So maybe the cognitive ability test is actually, maybe it has lower G loading, maybe it, there's all sorts of stuff that it could be that would produce a lower black-white gap, right? And so, maybe we could come to a conclusion that blacks in the UK, it's a product of the UK having some different measurements that produce a lower gap than the popular measurements in the US do. Like the SAT is a highly G-loaded test that almost perfectly mirrors an IQ test, for example. Okay, but that's a possibility. But then there's another possibility that the sample selected for the blacks in the U.S. was an elite sample that produced an average IQ of 92 as well. Like, there's all sorts of things it could be. But observations come first, right? Now, and so you do the observations and you play connect the dots later. Back to my video, White America. What I was doing is what Shaun did. Well, actually, in fairness, Shaun used a lot of data that I collected. So we'll say what we did was look at. What we did was we looked at whites in various ways, sort of in a way that's a statistical portrait of them, from out of the United States in a kind of a disintegrated way, right? We say, so here's the poverty rates of whites, here's the illegitimacy rates of whites, here's the violent crime rates of whites in the United States as it exists, and just sort of pull that out and creating sort of a fictitious country where white people with this statistical portrait would exist. Okay, and you could say that it's unrealistic because in reality, whites in the United States are heavily integrated economically with other races, and so you don't know for sure exactly what it's going to be. Fair enough, and you can level all those objections, but the observation still stands. Like, the observations that we made in White America are still valid. They're still valid observations. And so what Shaun and I, what Shaun and what also I do a lot is we make these posts that are, I guess you could call loaded observations. They're loaded observation posts where we have a lot of these where we basically find a lot of things about a particular topic, and you could say, well, you're cherry picking data and all this stuff. It's like, well, okay, fine. If you want to say we're cherry picking, go find the contra. Go show the other thing. Go show the things that we excluded. Okay, if you think we're cherry picking. But the reality is, if you just read a lot of stuff about about and a lot of our data comes from freaking liberals, okay, who put so much spin on their own data. If you just look at the data, all sorts of racist conclusions start popping out at you, okay, and in fact, it's funny. In fact, this is something that a lot of sociologists lament, is that if the laymen just see data, they come to all sorts of racist conclusions, and that's why there's all sorts of debates within among intelligence researchers, and there's a lot of debates among sociologists as to how much access the average Joe should have to sociological data. And it's even true in government. For example, the German government actually has violent crime statistics by race in Germany. They don't release them, okay? And making a bit of a leap here, but I think we know why they don't release them. And they don't release them because they don't want the public coming to the wrong conclusions. So that's a bit of a tangent there. Is that if you just like if you just let the observations come first and stop trying to throw your priors the onto the data so much, you tend to come to racist conclusions, right? And that's why that's why there's so much of an effort to suppress that data. For example, well, I'll just stop going on there. But yeah, basically observations come first. And one thing I notice about people who hold, again, plumb line Democrat, Republican, liberal, Tory beliefs is that they come to conclusions really fast. Okay, for them, observations don't come first, or they make a very small number of observations, then come to conclusions really fast. And so what happens sometimes is I'll make a video, right, where I just say a bunch of things, and then in the comment section they'll say something like, "Well, what are you trying to say? What's the point here? What's the punchline?" But the hell of it is, there's no punchline, okay? Because I'm not operating at the level of policy, I'm operating at the level of priors, okay? I'm not programming in C, I'm straight up assembly,